The bell above the shop door had not yet stilled when Mrs. Hartwell's voice cut across the room. "Cecily, the blue silk on the second form. It is crooked. It has been crooked since this morning, and I can only conclude that you wished me to notice it." There were 3 customers in the shop at that moment. A woman in dove-grey gloves stood near the window examining a bonnet trimmed with ivory ribbon. Her companion sat in the velvet chair beside the door, her hands folded, her expression carefully arranged to suggest she was not listening. A third woman, younger, had stopped in the act of reaching for a felt capote on the far shelf and left her hand suspended in the air, not quite certain whether to proceed. Cecily crossed to the second form without hurrying. She smoothed the silk with the flat of her palm, turning the small buckram stand a fraction to the left so the fabric draped evenly at the front. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. "There," she said, and stepped back. Mrs. Hartwell surveyed the correction with the expression of someone who had expected to find further fault and was mildly inconvenienced by the absence of it. "See that it remains so." She turned toward the woman in dove grey, and her voice warmed immediately, the way a fire does when someone opens the damper. "Now then, Mrs. Calloway, I believe we were discussing the osprey feathers." Cecily returned to the work table in the back corner, where a half-finished bonnet waited in its frame. She picked up the thread and resumed the work she had set down when summoned. Mrs. Fenwick, who occupied the work table beside her, did not look up, but there was a small, satisfied settling in her shoulders, the kind that does not require a face to be legible. 3 years of that. 3 years of the crooked silk and the implied incompetence, and the small public corrections issued in front of customers who had the good breeding to pretend they were not watching. Cecily had learned to let the words arrive, absorb them the way rain is absorbed by good wool, and go on with the work. There was no profit in anything else. She had a room she paid for on Tuesday mornings, a coat that still held its shape, and a skill that no one in this shop could honestly claim to exceed, however little they chose to acknowledge it. The work table smelled of cedar and beeswax, and faintly of the lavender water she pressed into ribbon to keep it from curling. The bonnet frame in her hands was for a Mrs. Dolan who wanted a medium blue with sage green trim and had changed her mind twice already about the ribbon width. Cecily had kept each revision on a small paper she folded into the inside of her apron pocket, where the customers could not see that she needed it. She was working the trim into place when the shop bell rang again, and a man came in. He was not the sort of man Mrs. Hartwell's shop typically produced. He was wearing a coat that had been good once, a dark wool with narrow lapels, now slightly too short in the sleeve, not from poverty of fabric, but from the confident ease with which he moved in it, as though the coat's present condition had simply not occurred to him as a relevant consideration. He was carrying a wrapped parcel and looking around the room with the calm attention of someone who was used to reading rooms without being read himself. Mrs. Hartwell did not look at him. Mrs. Fenwick did not look at him. The woman in dove-grey gloves continued her conversation about osprey feathers without registering that anyone had entered. Cecily looked up from the bonnet. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you find someone?" He turned, and there was a fraction of a pause before he answered. Not confusion, not calculation, something quieter. "I'm to leave a delivery," he said, "for Mrs. Hartwell. A consignment of buttons from Morrison & Sons. I'll see she gets it." Cecily set down the frame, crossed to him, and took the parcel. It was lighter than it looked. She signed the delivery slip he held out, her signature small and precise. "Do you know your way back to the Strand from here, or were you turned around coming in?" He looked at her. "I was," he said, and she thought she heard something in it, some small note of surprise that she had noticed. She told him. Left at the top of the lane, then right at the chemist's, and the Strand would be in front of him before he reached the second crossing. He listened without writing anything down, and she had the impression he would not need to. He said thank you in the measured way of someone who means it specifically rather than generally, and he went out. She was back at the work table before the bell finished its second note. The parcel of buttons went on the shelf by the door, where Mrs. Hartwell collected deliveries. Mrs. Fenwick had watched none of this and had somehow conveyed awareness of all of it. The rain began at 3:30. It came without preamble, the way October rain often does in London, the sky simply deciding it had been patient long enough. The drops were heavy and immediate, striking the shop window in a wide grey sheet that distorted the street into something impressionistic, all smeared light and hurrying shapes. Cecily was the one to close up. Mrs. Hartwell departed at 4 o'clock precisely, pausing at the door to say that the inventory of the back room wanted doing before Friday, and to look at Cecily in the way that communicated the work would not do itself. Mrs. Fenwick left 10 minutes after, pulling on her gloves with the satisfied unhaste of someone who does not take work home with her. Cecily did the inventory alone. She counted the hat pins and the bundles of grosgrain and the small wooden moulds stacked on the high shelf at the back. She wrote the figures in the ledger in the even hand she kept for numbers, locked the back room, and put on her coat. The street outside was a study in wet misery. The gutter ran fast with brown water, and the pavement stones had that particular sheen that makes London look, for a moment, like a city assembled from mirror and shadow. She stood under the shop's narrow overhang and calculated the walk to her lodgings. 12 minutes in fine weather. Rather more now, with no sensible path that avoided the open stretch by the church. The carriage appeared at the curb a few moments later. A hired coach, dark bay horse, the driver huddled under his box with his collar turned to his ears. The door opened from inside, and James, still in the short-sleeved coat, leaned out. "I find I'm going past Marchmont Street," he said. "If you live somewhere nearby." She looked at him. He was perfectly composed, and that composure told her something she could not entirely name. "I don't, actually," she said. "I'm the other direction." "Ah." He did not press it. He waited. She watched the rain for a moment, running a small calculation of her own. "Thank you," she said. "I'll manage." He nodded once, and then he was quiet in the way of someone who has decided something and is acting on it without requiring comment. He stepped down from the carriage, went around to the driver and spoke to him briefly. She saw the driver look toward the street, consider something, and then click to the horse and move on. A woman further down the pavement, elderly and thin, was standing very still with her hand raised, and the carriage stopped beside her. James came back to where Cecily stood. He was carrying nothing, which was somehow noticeable. He had put on a hat at some point, a plain dark one, and the rain was already beginning to find the brim. "Which way?" he said. She stared at him. "You gave it away." "She was standing in the rain," he said, as though this were the full accounting. Cecily looked at the carriage door as the elderly woman was helped inside, the door closing with a solid, satisfied sound. Then she looked at the man beside her, who was already getting wet and had arrived at this state through an entirely voluntary series of choices. "Left," she said after a moment, "down past the chemist's." They walked. The rain was not kind. It found the gap between her collar and her neck and settled there with proprietorial ease, and the pavement was uneven enough in 3 places that she had to watch her footing. He matched her pace, which was slightly faster than most men expected, and he did not make conversation about the weather or offer remarks about the inconvenience of October. He said very little. When they passed the chemist's and turned towards the Market Road, he remarked that the pavement was worse here, and she said she knew. They stopped at the corner where her street turned off, because her lodging house was visible from there, and she had long since decided she preferred to arrive at it alone. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Not at all." He was looking at the middle distance, not at her, and there was something in his profile in the rain that was composed enough to be interesting, the way certain things are interesting that look like one thing on first examination and prompt a second look. She went in. She did not turn to see whether he remained at the corner, but she was aware, in the particular way one is aware of things one has decided not to investigate, that he stood there for a moment before he moved. He came into the shop the following morning, not with a delivery. He came in at 10:30, when Cecily was alone in the front room, Mrs. Hartwell and Mrs. Fenwick both occupied in the back with a customer's fitting, and he stood in the doorway as though he had not fully decided whether to cross it. "I wanted to see," he said, "whether the silk was still straight." It was such a precise and odd thing to say that she stood still for a moment, holding a length of cream satin she'd been measuring. He had heard that then. He had been in the room for that. "It is," she said. He came in. He looked at the forms along the wall with the serious attention of someone who has learned to look at things he does not know and make an honest accounting of them. He asked her about the construction of the one nearest the window, the wide-brimmed structure with the wire interior frame, and whether the buckram was cut on the bias or the grain. She told him, and then she told him why it mattered, which no one had ever bothered to ask her. He listened in a way that made her words feel like they were landing somewhere, rather than simply dissipating into the air above a conversation. He came back the next day as well. The third day he was there when Mrs. Hartwell returned from a delivery call, and she looked at him standing at the work table in the front room, where Cecily was explaining the difference between a drawn bonnet and a cottage bonnet to a customer who had asked, and Mrs. Hartwell's expression arranged itself into the particular formation she reserved for things that were technically unobjectionable and personally irritating. "Mr. Anderson," she said, because Cecily had said his name once, in introducing him to the customer, and Mrs. Hartwell retained every name she heard, the way a ledger retains a figure. "Is there something the shop can do for you?" It was not quite a question. "I was admiring your collection," he said. "The workmanship is quite fine." Mrs. Hartwell received this as her due. She did not acknowledge that the workmanship was Cecily's. The conversation ended without resolving into anything Mrs. Hartwell could formally object to, and she went into the back room, and Cecily heard her say something low to Mrs. Fenwick that she could not catch. The fourth day brought a cold blue light, the kind that follows several days of rain when the clouds finally break and the air turns sharp, and the city looks briefly as though someone has cleaned it. Cecily arrived at the shop at 8 o'clock, which was her habit, and let herself in through the side entrance and put the kettle on the small stove in the back room, and began the work that was easier to do before Mrs. Hartwell arrived and required the appearance of a different kind of attention. She was there when she heard the voices. The wall between the back room and the small office off the corridor was thin, the way walls are in old buildings that were divided after the fact rather than built for privacy. Miss Hartwell's voice carried through it with the casual clarity of someone who assumed she was not being heard, which was a reasonable assumption because Cecily did not usually arrive this early. "Before the month is out," Mrs. Hartwell was saying, "I have already written to the agency." Mrs. Fenwick's response was too low to make out clearly, but the shape of it was agreement. "She is perfectly competent," Mrs. Hartwell said, and there was in her voice the tone of someone offering a concession that costs nothing. "She has always been perfectly competent, but Mrs. Calloway finds her manner wanting, and Mrs. Calloway is not a woman whose preferences I can ignore. Besides, I believe a more presentable face at the front counter would be advantageous. The Fenwick girl has an aunt who is looking for a position. She would do very well." The kettle had come to a boil. Cecily took it off the heat. She set it down on the iron rest with more care than was strictly necessary, because her hands wanted to be doing something specific and controlled. 3 years. The inventory she had been asked to take, the corrections she had absorbed, the customers whose preferences she had memorized down to their particular dislike of ostrich feathers, or their need for wider ribbons because of the way they tied their bows. The work she had done because it was work, because she was good at it, because she had believed, without ever quite stating the belief to herself, that good work accumulated into something that could not simply be dismissed. She stood in the back room for a long moment, with her hands on the cool iron handle of the kettle. Then she made the tea, poured Mrs. Hartwell's cup and left it on the tray, and went out to the front room to begin the morning. James arrived at 10:30 as he had the 3 days before. He stopped when he saw her face. Not the expression on it, which she had controlled entirely, but something else, some quality in the stillness of her. He did not ask. He came to the work table and looked at the work she was doing, a brown velvet trimmed with pheasant feathers for a Mrs. Oates, and he was quiet beside her in the way of someone who understands that silence is sometimes the only honest response. After several minutes, she said, without looking up from the trim, "I am to be dismissed before the month is out." He was still for a moment. "Did she tell you?" "I overheard it. He absorbed this." "What will you do?" "What I have been doing," she said, "until the month is out." He looked at the bonnet in her hands. She worked the feather mount with a small needle and a thread nearly invisible against the velvet, and her movements were precise and unhurried, and he was watching her, in a way she felt, without looking. The customer came in at just past noon. She was young, perhaps 19, in a coat that had been let out twice at the seams and still pulled at the shoulders. She was carrying a small purse with the focused grip of someone who has counted its contents recently and often. She wanted a bonnet, she said, for her sister's wedding. Something simple, something in a light colour. Cecily showed her 3. The young woman studied each one with the seriousness of limited means, applied to an important occasion, and at the end of her deliberation she chose the simplest, a chip straw trimmed with narrow pale yellow ribbon, and asked the price with the careful face of someone prepared for disappointment. Cecily told her. The woman's expression shifted fractionally, a small rearrangement of resignation around the eyes. She opened the purse and began to count out coins on the counter with the slow, methodical care of someone making numbers arrive at a total that will not quite come. The shortfall was 1 shilling and 4pence. Cecily watched the count reach its end. She looked at the young woman's hands, still on the coins, and at the chip straw bonnet, and at the coat with the twice-let seams. "I believe I made an error," Cecily said. "I quoted you the price before last month's adjustment. The yellow ribbon is cheaper than I said. It comes to what you have there." The young woman looked up. Her relief was so immediate and complete that it occupied her face like weather. "Are you certain?" "I keep the figures in my head," Cecily said. "I sometimes make that mistake." She did not make that mistake. She wrapped the bonnet herself, in the thin brown paper she saved for small purchases, tied it with a length of yellow ribbon that she cut from the spool at her own table rather than the shop's supply, and accepted the coins the young woman placed in her hand with both of hers. James was standing in the doorway to the front room. He had not announced himself. Cecily had been aware of him for some minutes, in the way she had been aware of things lately without quite deciding whether to look. He said nothing as the young woman went out. He was very still against the doorframe. She did not look at him directly. She wrote the adjusted price in the sales ledger in her even hand, the difference absorbed by the shilling and 4pence she would take from her own wages at week's end, because she kept her own small accounting for such occasions, and this was not the first time she had found a price that wanted correcting. She closed the ledger. James pushed off the doorframe and came to where she was standing. He stopped when there was only the work table between them, and he was close enough that she could see the thread count of his coat lapel, which was finer than a tradesman's coat had any cause to be. And she had been aware of that fact for 3 days, without following the thought to wherever it led. "Cecily," he said, and her name in his mouth landed differently than it did in Mrs. Hartwell's, which was always clipped, or Mrs. Fenwick's, which she avoided using at all. He said it as though it meant something specific, and he was deciding whether he had the right to mean it. She met his eyes. The warm afternoon light came through the window glass and crossed the work table between them, illuminating the half-finished work, the scattered spools, the small paper with Mrs. Dolan's ribbon revisions. She waited. "I have not been fully honest with you," he said, "about who I am." She said nothing because she had been aware of this for 3 days and had not known what to do with the awareness. "I don't know," he said carefully, "that I can explain my reasons in a way that doesn't sound self-serving. Except that I've been in too many rooms where the furniture changed the moment my name was announced, and I wanted to be in a room where it didn't, just once more." She turned this over in the quiet space between them. "You've been sitting at my work table for 4 days," she said at last. "I know. And asking me about buckram cut on the bias." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it that was warmer and more honest than one. "I genuinely wanted to know," he said. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. The shop was quiet around them. The tick of the bracket clock on the shelf over Mrs. Hartwell's desk, the street sounds filtered through the thick old glass. She was aware that she was standing in a room from which she was to be dismissed before the month was out, talking to a man who had given his carriage to a stranger in the rain, and then walked 12 minutes in the wrong direction to come no closer than this corner, and that the combination of these facts produced something she had no suitable language for, and was not certain she was ready to find. "I should get back to work," she said. He nodded. He stepped back. He did not leave. The door opened and Thomas came in. He was a precise, neat man in a charcoal coat, carrying a leather document case under one arm with the systematic care of someone for whom misplacing papers is a philosophical impossibility. He looked around the room in the brisk way of someone arriving at a known location and verifying it against a mental inventory. His gaze found James. It moved over him with the efficiency of long habit and then steadied with the particular quality of a person who has been looking for someone and found them. "Mr. James Alderton Anderson," Thomas said, and it was not an announcement, not a performance, simply the plain name of a plain fact. "Your father's solicitor is at the house. He's been there since 9 o'clock and has asked me to remind you that the shipping consortium papers close tomorrow morning. He said to tell you the board has been informed that you'll be signing." The room performed one of those total silences that are actually full of sound, the clock still ticking, the street still moving, a horse somewhere outside finding a cobble it disliked, but around which everything else seemed to have paused. Cecily was still. She looked at James, who was looking at Thomas with the measured expression of a man who has just had the floor shift under him in a way he had known for some days was coming. Mrs. Hartwell had emerged from the back corridor in the way of a woman with a particular instinct for conversations that might be relevant to her interests. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, her gaze moving from Thomas to James, and something behind her expression was doing rapid arithmetic. "The Anderson Shipping Consortium," she said. The words came out slightly too carefully, the way words do when someone is buying time for the numbers to complete themselves. Thomas looked at her with the polite incuriosity of a man who has no information about her that is relevant to his purpose. "If I may, sir," he said to James, "the solicitor is not a patient man." "I know," James said. He had not moved. He was looking at Cecily. Mrs. Hartwell, Mrs. Fenwick said from somewhere behind her, faintly, in the tone of someone who has just understood something and wishes she had understood it considerably earlier. Mrs. Hartwell moved away from the doorframe. She came a few steps into the room and stopped, which was not a thing she ordinarily did. Stopped in the middle of a room without a purpose, without a customer to attend or a correction to issue. She looked at James Anderson, at his coat that was good wool after all, at his hands that had the steadiness of a man who did not spend time worrying about what was in his pockets, at the ease with which he stood in a space he had not previously owned and yet appeared in this moment to own completely. "Mr. Anderson," she said. Her voice had developed a quality it did not usually have. A care, a margin of error built in, the way you build margins into columns of figures you are no longer certain you have correctly totaled. He looked at her. Just looked. He did not say anything cold or anything warm. He simply allowed her to be present in the room with what she had just understood. "I believe, Mrs. Hartwell said, and paused. "I believe there may have been an impression given." She paused again. "Regarding certain employment arrangements." Cecily said nothing. She had set her hands flat on the work table, one on each side of the ledger she had closed, and she was watching Mrs. Hartwell with the quiet attention of someone who has been doing this for 3 years, and can do it for as long as the present moment requires. "Miss Marsh is," Mrs. Hartwell said, and the sentence lost its footing somewhere in the middle and did not recover. "That is, she has always been. I have always considered her. The workmanship is quite—" She stopped. She seemed to recognize that the workmanship was precisely the wrong place to have arrived and could not locate another destination quickly enough. Mrs. Fenwick, in the doorway, had gone the colour of old tallow. She was looking at a point on the wall to the left of everyone involved, which was perhaps the safest available surface. James spoke then, finally, and when he did, it was not to Mrs. Hartwell. It was to Cecily. "I have a proposition," he said. It was the same measured, unhurried voice he'd used to ask about Buckram and to say thank you for directions he hadn't needed. "There is a millinery house in Kensington that my family has had a peripheral interest in for about 12 years, and which has needed a head of workroom for longer than I should have allowed. I wondered whether you might be interested in discussing it." Cecily looked at him. "The salary," he said, "is rather more than you are currently paid." He did not name a number because it was not the number that mattered, and they both understood that. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, taking stock, the way you take stock of a road before you step onto it, not because you are afraid of it, but because you have learned to see clearly first and move second. "I would be interested," she said, "in discussing it." Thomas, who had weathered this entire exchange with the equanimity of a man who has stood in rooms through considerably more dramatic negotiations, cleared his throat with professional discretion. "Sir," the solicitor. "Yes." James held Cecily's gaze for a moment longer. Then he moved to follow Thomas to the door and stopped once, briefly, with his hand on the frame, the same doorframe she had watched him fill for 4 mornings. "The bonnet," he said without turning. "For the woman with the seamed coat, the price came out right." He went out. Thomas followed. The bell above the door rang once, twice, in the familiar way, and then it stilled. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Hartwell stood in the centre of it, neither forward nor back, with the look of a woman who has been applying a measuring system she was certain of and has discovered that the units were wrong from the start. She turned once toward Mrs. Fenwick, but Mrs. Fenwick was still examining the wall and offered nothing. Cecily gathered the velvet trim for Mrs. Oates's bonnet, the pheasant feathers and the small needle and the nearly invisible thread, and she carried them back to the work table and sat down. She began to work. Her hands were steady, as they had always been. Mrs. Hartwell said, at last, very quietly, "The agency letter." She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. The letter would not be sent, or it would be recalled, or it would not matter, because the consequences that the letter was meant to produce had been overtaken by a reality that letters could not adjust. The bracket clock on the shelf ticked on. Outside, the street moved through its usual morning business. Boots on cobblestones, a vendor somewhere to the east calling out a price, a carriage wheel finding the same uneven stone it found every day. The shop smelled of cedar and beeswax, and the faint lavender of pressed ribbon, exactly as it always had. Cecily finished the pheasant feather mount and examined her work. It was good. It had always been good. She folded the small paper from her apron pocket, the one with Mrs. Dolan's ribbon revisions, and set it on the corner of the table where she would find it in the morning. The morning she went to see the millinery house in Kensington, the light was the same kind as the day the rain had broken, cold and blue and newly cleaned. She walked the whole distance because it was not far, and because she was not a woman who hailed cabs when her own feet were available, and the weather had decided to cooperate. The house was on a wide street lined with plane trees that had dropped most of their leaves, which lay in drifts against the iron railings in the amber and brown of late October. The sign above the door was painted in dark green, simple lettering, the kind that does not need to announce itself, because it has been there long enough that everyone worth knowing already knows it. James was waiting outside. He had come from the solicitor's, she gathered, because he was wearing a coat she had not seen before, a longer one, charcoal grey, well fitted in the way that was simply what it was rather than what it was trying to suggest. He was standing with his back against the railing looking up at the sign, and when she came along the pavement, he looked at her instead. And there was, in his expression, the same thing she had seen at the work table the day before, the same careful, specific attention. "The buckram," she said as she reached him, "in the window display. It is cut on the grain." He glanced at the window. "Is that wrong?" "It will curl in a season." She looked up at the sign. Then she looked at him. "You should have someone in there who knows better." "Yes," he said. "I should." They stood for a moment together on the pavement in front of the green sign, in the cool blue October light, with the plane tree leaves collecting quietly along the railing. And neither of them said what the other one knew, because there was no need to say it with words when the rain had already done that work. 4 mornings ago, in the 12 minutes between a shop door and a corner where he had stood for longer than he needed to before he finally moved. She stepped forward and opened the door, and the bell above it rang, and she went in.